Classical conditioning is a form of learning in which an organism learns to associate two stimuli. When a neutral stimulus is repeatedly paired with one that naturally produces a response, the neutral stimulus eventually produces that response on its own. This is the origin of countless automatic reactions. Ivan Pavlov, a Russian physiologist studying digestion, discovered classical conditioning accidentally. He noticed that dogs began salivating before food arrived, at the sight of the food dish, or even the approach of the lab assistant. This anticipatory salivation was not a reflex, but a learned response. The unconditioned stimulus, UCS, is any stimulus that naturally and automatically produces a response without prior learning. Food in Pavlov's experiments was the UCS. The unconditioned response, UCR, is the automatic reaction, salivation. No training required, it's wired in. The conditioned stimulus begins as a neutral stimulus, a bell, a tone, a light, that produces no relevant response. After repeated pairing with the unconditioned stimulus, the neutral stimulus acquires the power to elicit a conditioned response on its own. The neutral stimulus has become conditioned. Acquisition is the initial learning phase in which the conditioned response develops and strengthens. The conditioned stimulus must reliably precede the unconditioned stimulus, ideally by about half a second. With each pairing, the conditioned response typically grows stronger until it reaches a stable level. If the conditioned stimulus is repeatedly presented without the unconditioned stimulus, the conditioned response gradually weakens and eventually disappears. This process is called extinction. Importantly, extinction doesn't erase the original learning, it suppresses it. The association remains latent in memory. Evidence that extinction doesn't erase learning comes from spontaneous recovery. After an extinguished response, a rest period without any conditioning or extinction causes the conditioned response to reappear spontaneously. This has profound clinical implications. Treating a fear doesn't eliminate the underlying association. Stimulus generalization means that stimuli similar to the original conditioned stimulus will also produce the conditioned response. A dog conditioned to salivate to a specific tone will also salivate to similar tones. This explains why trauma survivors respond not just to the original trigger, but to anything resembling it. Discrimination is the flip side of generalization. With experience, organisms learn to distinguish the conditioned stimulus from similar stimuli that don't predict the unconditioned stimulus. Pavlov demonstrated this by conditioning dogs to differentiate between similar shapes, one paired with food and one not. John Watson, founder of behaviorism, extended Pavlov's principles to human psychology. He famously claimed he could condition any infant to become any kind of person, regardless of heredity, a dramatic overstatement that nonetheless highlighted how powerfully conditioning shapes human behavior. Watson's Little Albert experiment conditioned an infant to fear a white rat by pairing it with a loud, startling noise. The conditioned fear generalized to a rabbit, a dog, and a fur coat. The experiment demonstrated that human emotional responses can be acquired through classical conditioning. Taste aversion is a dramatic exception to classical conditioning's usual rules. A single pairing of a food with subsequent illness, even hours later, produces a strong, lasting aversion to that food. This violates the principle that conditioning requires immediate, repeated pairings, revealing evolved preparedness in learning. Biological preparedness means that evolution has predisposed animals, including humans, to acquire certain associations more easily than others. Fear is more easily conditioned to snakes and spiders than to flowers and mushrooms. Learning doesn't operate on a blank slate, but is shaped by ancestral experience. In higher-order conditioning, a well-established conditioned stimulus can itself function as an unconditioned stimulus, conditioning responses to yet another neutral stimulus. This chaining process helps explain how complex emotional responses become attached to remote symbols, including words, logos, and images. Classical conditioning contributes to drug tolerance. Cues associated with drug use trigger conditioned compensatory responses, the body's anticipatory counterreactions to the expected drug. In familiar environments, tolerance is high. In novel settings, the same drug dose can cause overdose because compensatory responses don't fire. Classical conditioning has direct clinical applications. Exposure therapy for phobias and PTSD works by repeatedly presenting the conditioned fear stimulus without the feared outcome, extinguishing the conditioned response. Understanding the neuroscience of extinction is driving improvements in how this therapy is delivered.